meeting of East Anglia Socialist Workers' Party. My name's Mary. I'm going to be chairing the meeting. I'm a comrade from South Norfolk. Tonight's speaker is James Eaden, who's from Derbyshire, and he's going to be speaking about Afghanistan, the bloody failure of US imperialism, which is, you know, obviously the thing that's in everybody's minds because of the news, but also the things that are happening about refugees as well, which we will talk about later in terms of what's going on to support refugees. But first of all, we need to have a really good understanding, I think, of what's actually going on, because it's very complicated and has been going on a long time, obviously, as everyone knows. As veterans of Stop the War, some of us have been around the whole of the Afghan conflict in terms of politics. So it'll be very interesting to find out what James has to say on the topic. So James is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and contributions. You can make a point, say what you think. Okay, so over to James. Thanks, James.
Hi there, comrades. Really good to be here with you. First I want to say, Mary said it's very complicated. It is, and there's a whole bunch of things I'm really not going to be talking about tonight, or at least not in any detail, that are important. I'm just going to go through a list with them. I'm not really going to have time to talk about the economic, class and social structure of Afghanistan, nor about the ethnic divisions of Afghanistan. I'm not really going into much depth about who the Taliban are. I'll say a few things about them. I'm not going to talk much about the long history of imperialist intervention in Afghanistan, or the role of the communists when they were in power in the 1970s, which is very, very important as well. And I'm not going to say much about Britain's specific role or the role of the anti-war movement. So there's a whole bunch of things that people want to ask questions or contribute about, but I'm not really going to have time to talk about in any detail. What I do want to talk about is really, I suppose, three main things. One is to just reflect on the scale of the defeat and humiliation of Western imperialism, reflected by what's taken place over the last week or so. So I'll say a few things about that. I'm going to talk about, the Taliban victory. Why is the Taliban won? And then I want to conclude really on, I see someone's opening a big package of this week's Socialist Worker on what's on the front page of this week's Socialist Worker, which is a big headline that talks about the 20 years of bloody war. And really look at the occupation really of Afghanistan and the invasion of Afghanistan after 2001, which of course was done on the basis of a humanitarian intervention to defend liberalism, to bring democracy to Afghanistan, and particularly to protect the rights of women. So those are three things I'm going to mainly talk about. So really just about the scale of the defeat. Obviously in the last few days, people have been talking about that, and some of the images very famously of the helicopters over the Kabul American embassy, very redolent of the images we saw way back in the 1970s, the fall of Saigon, when America imperialism really suffered a hugely bloody defeat at the hands of the Vietnamese people, and people drawing that comparison. But also, I think if anyone had the misfortune to listen to the debate in Parliament today, that sort of, the mood of sort of somber, pessimism really amongst the representatives of the British ruling class met there as they sort of floundered around looking for something to say about Afghanistan, really brought home, I think, the scale of the humiliation and defeat that's taken place for Western imperialism. When we think about it, the military power of the biggest, not just the biggest by far armed power in the world, the United States, has effectively been humiliated by a small insurgent force around the Taliban. And of course, this hasn't just happened in the last week or so, has it? The US knew the game was up in Afghanistan a while ago. They opened negotiations with the Taliban back in 2014, I believe. Been in negotiations for 6 or 7 years to try and extricate the United States from the turmoil. They did a deal 18 months ago that Trump signed with the Taliban, but very much with the support of the American military establishment, by the way, to effectively pull America out because they knew they couldn't continue there. So that deal was done 18 months ago, and after that, it was simply a matter of time as to when the occupation regime, the regime in Afghanistan that had been propped up and supported by the occupation forces, would end. Now, everyone, of course, was surprised and shocked at the speed that took place, but that it took place, I think, is no great shock and no great surprise. And I think the fact that the victory came so quickly, I think, is testament to the fact that the real lack of any real significant social base for the Afghan government and the army once US military support had effectively been withdrawn. Back in Tsarist Russia, they used to talk about Potemkin villages. These were when the Tsar used to go on a tour of the countryside, and they, down the big rivers, they'll build these fake villages, wouldn't they, on the sides of the rivers, which are essentially just cardboard fronts to show the great developments in the country. In many ways, the Afghan regime has been a Potemkin village which has toppled. And really for America, that's very important. I want to sort of step back really and think about American power and American imperialism, because really, if we think about it, since pretty much the end of the Second World War, end of the First World War really, 1918, 1919, America has really become and been the dominant power in the globe, both militarily and economically, and particularly enhancing its power in the period after the Second World War. We've lived through an American century, really, and that power has been really, really important in terms of shaping the world and representing America's power in the world. Of course, it's been challenged at different times, but has really been hegemonic in the world. And American power, I think, has rested on three main pillars. First is its economic power as the biggest economy, and its control of the global finance system, very, very important for American capitalism and its power. Secondly, American soft power. It's sort of what you might call its idea of being a democracy, and the idea of being a liberal democracy, its idea of competence, and its idea of sort of cultural leadership in the world. The sort of predominance of the English language, of American-based culture, all those things are very, very important manifestations of American soft power in the world. And thirdly, and very importantly, the hard power of its military force and ability to intervene decisively militarily. Now, American economic power has been in decline for a number of years. It's declined, it's a long-term decline, accelerated very much by the rise of China in recent decades. And the strategy pushed by the American ruling class, particularly from the 1990s with the Bush strategy, the new American century strategy, which is where the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan came from, was that America could use its still hegemonic military power to assert itself and to establish itself and establish its hegemony and control over key regions in the world, particularly in that case in the Middle East, to compensate for its declining economic power, could put up its military power to do that. And really, defeats first in Iraq and now in Afghanistan really show the limitations and limitations of that strategy. And I think that's very, very important. So economic power very much on the decline. And now this is a significant defeat for America's military power. After the defeat in Vietnam, it was said the Americans for a generation didn't feel confident to intervene. I think the same will be true in terms of American power after Afghanistan. That's not to say America doesn't remain a very powerful military force, and they have the ability through missiles and air power, etc., to project their military force very significantly. But the ability to put boots on the ground and sort of conquer and subdue insurgent movements or in countries that step out of line, I think is severely limited. So that's really, really important. In terms of the region, of course, as well, the American retreat has opened up the opportunities for other powers to move in and to assert their position. Of course, we've all read about China. China's already done a deal with the Taliban. Very, very importantly, the whole Belt and Road project that the Chinese have, the opening up of Afghanistan to their influence opens up all sorts of opportunities for the Chinese in that respect. But other regional, Russia as well, and other regional powers like Iran, Pakistan, who've been highly engaged in Afghanistan for decades now, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So I think it is a very, very significant setback and defeat for American imperialism that we've seen today, and it has been illustrated by the events of the past few days in a really significant sense. So having said that, let's just turn our attention to the question about the Taliban and look at how and why the Taliban won, really. And in a way, this has been a long time coming. It's wrong to see the Taliban victory, although it's been very dramatically illustrated in the last week or so, the spectacularly rapid collapse of the regime. This has been a long time coming. As I said, they've been in negotiations with the Americans for 6 or 7 years, precisely because the Americans understood there was no effective military strategy to defeat this insurgency in any real way. And what I want to do really to try to get heads around some of the reasons why the Taliban were successful is actually look back at the last time the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan in 1996, when they established control over Kabul and much of the country in the first Taliban regime in many ways. And look at the circumstances of that and draw some comparisons. Because back in 1996, what the Taliban, the context of that was the chaos, corruption, and violence of the rival warlords who effectively were in control in Afghanistan after the collapse of the Russian-supported so-called communist government of the 1970s and 1980s. Afghanistan had become, the Russian occupation and war was a brutal, brutal experience for Afghanistan. By the way, the level of casualties and deaths during that period far, far higher than they have been in the last 20 years, just in terms of the physical damage and destruction to Afghanistan. Kabul was literally a city in ruins in 1996 when the Taliban drove in and took control. It's not the case today, by the way. Kabul is not a smoking set of ruins. It was then because of the scale of the fighting, both during the Russian occupation and during the civil war that followed. But the corruption, chaos, and violence of those people who were ruling Afghanistan made them hugely unpopular amongst the Afghan people. And the Taliban offered a degree of stability and an end to corruption. Now, of course, when they came to power, stability meant extreme repression and also a huge misogynistic and sexist regime in terms of women. But they did deliver to an extent on the idea of ending corruption. That's very, very important. It's important to say in 1996 and again today, the Taliban were not hugely popular when they came to power. It's not that they came to power on a wave of popular support, either then or now. It's just that the other options were even less popular than what the Taliban had to offer. It's also true in 1996 that the Taliban used a form of ethnic nationalism in Afghanistan. They were based in the Pashtun region of southern and central Afghanistan, and they used that to really cement their base in that locality, and that gave them, they keyed into a strong element of Pashtun nationalism, which has always been there in Afghanistan, particularly amongst sections of the Afghan ruling elite, and that gave a certain legitimacy at that time. And it's also worth saying that in 1996, when they came to power at least partially as a result of a deal and a compromise. It wasn't that the Americans, particularly through the Pakistanis, in 1996 were actually backing the Taliban as an option to bring some stability and order to Afghanistan at the time. And you think about those contexts back in 1996, a lot of them apply today, with some exceptions. But the chaos, corruption, and violence I'm going to talk about in a minute of the current regime, or the regime which has fallen in Afghanistan, is a crucial point. The fact that the Taliban are not coming to power on the basis of a huge wave of popular support. We don't see huge demonstrations in the streets of Kabul supporting the Taliban. We see crowds of people looking askew and wondering what it's going to be like. What's going on here. It's not a massive degree of popular support that they have. Interestingly, this does raise a question about the Taliban, which has been discussed quite a lot. Is this a new Taliban? Have they changed, etc.? And there's quite a lot of debate about that, and certainly aspects of continuity. Absolutely, they've done a deal with the Americans this time. They did a deal last time round. Interesting, they've dropped quite a lot of elements of their Pashtun nationalism. Although their Pashtun nationalism helped them get to power in 1996, it really created a real block, their sectarianism that they had against minority groups in Afghanistan presented a real block to them, getting control of the whole country. And large elements of the north of Pakistan, where we have Uzbek and Hazari minorities, never really came under Taliban control during that period. They dropped quite a lot of that. That's a significant change. They talk about the attitude towards women changing. Well, we shall see, and that they're not so high. Well, the proof will be in the pudding of all those sorts of things. And it's also worth to say, I haven't got time to go into this now, but the Taliban themselves are, there are significant internal divisions within the Taliban between, what you might generally call more moderate and more hardline elements. Interesting, one thing that has changed is their attitude towards the opium trade. Back in 1996, the Taliban were fiercely oppositional to the opium trade and shut down the opium trade insignificant amount. This time now, the Taliban come to power, controlling at least in some important sections of the Afghan opium trade, and that's an important difference. Okay, so that's a few things about the Taliban coming to power. I want to just come to my final section really now, is to look at the disaster of the 20 years of occupation, because today in Parliament there was so much bluster and cant from MPs on both sides of the House, from the Tories, the Labour MPs, Keir Starmer, about the great achievements of the past 20 years, about the progress that had been made, about everything we built in the last 20 years has been thrown away in a week, etc. So all that sort of stuff, which is frankly just complete and utter nonsense and rubbish, basically, to talk about. And the dominant narrative used to justify the bombing of occupation of Afghanistan, actually since the late 1990s, was the idea that this was about the defense of women's rights, democracy, and progress. And those of us who were around at the time will remember, you used to get people like Sherry Blair and Laura Bush, didn't you, stood on the steps of Downing Street or the White House to make these sanctimonious comments about what we're doing to defend the women of Afghanistan, etc., etc. All that is complete and cynical hypocrisy. There's a great little piece written by John Usinger on the Socialist Worker website today, and John's always good at this stuff. And he's got a really nice quote here from a British intelligence official at the time about the whole humanitarian intervention thing. He said, "It's always helpful for governments who want to get the Guardian readers of the world on board to have a humanitarian logic." And I think that absolutely rings true. They want to get, and that's important, because we remember the campaign against the Iraq War. The Iraq War was always less popular than the Afghan War, wasn't it? Because there was always this narrative in Afghanistan about humanitarian intervention was used to sell it, and it had a certain purchase. And by the way, it still does today in terms of a lot of the debates that are taking place right now. So let's just think about the Afghan government that was put into power and the regime that has just collapsed now. This was a regime of complete corruption and brutality. Let's be clear about this. You may remember some of the key figures in the regime, the public face of them. There's a man called Karzai, wasn't there? Who was, and the guy who's just now left Ghani. They're the two main public faces of the Afghan government over the last 20 years that we're familiar with. And they're both very good for Western TV, aren't they? Very polished, very Western educated, speak English very well, come across very, very well on the liberal TV interviews, don't they? As, liberal, modernizing, westernizing, all that sort of stuff. And very good to present the idea that that is really what was going on in Afghanistan in terms of social progress, etc. But essentially, behind this facade, including them, by the way, Karzai himself deeply corrupt. Bizarrely, Ghani probably not quite as corrupt, but Karzai hugely corrupt individual in terms of his own himself. But behind that, essentially, the government consisted of an alliance of many of the same warlords who had fought back in the 1990s, who controlled different parts of the country. And these people are effectively completely corrupt and criminal elements, deeply involved in narcotics and the narcotics trade. And again, just to give you some quotes on this, just hang on whilst I find them, about the level and scale of corruption. Of course, many of the military personnel sent in, the administrators sent in by the British and the Americans understood this. They saw what was going on around them, and the more candid of them have talked about this. So here we've got Sarah Chase, who worked as a senior advisor for the International Security and Assistance Force, effectively the occupation force. This is what she described the Afghan government as. She said it's a vertically integrated criminal organization whose core activity is not, in fact, exercising the functions of a state, but rather extracting resources for personal gain. General Petraeus, David Petraeus, who was the American commander in Afghanistan, described the government as a criminal syndicate. So these are the people that American soldiers were fighting and British soldiers were fighting to defend and uphold, and that they could see that effectively it was a criminal syndicate. As I said, Karzai himself was completely corrupt, and in what you could only call it, if it wasn't so tragic, a comedic episode. When Karzai came under some pressure a few years ago because of his alleged corruption, he decided he had to appoint an anti-corruption czar to deal with corruption in the Afghan government. So he chose a guy called Izzatullah Wasifi to be who was until 3 days ago the anti-corruption whatever you call it, czar or minister, whatever, inside the Afghan government. This is a guy, and you can look at the Guardian story about it, who was once arrested in a Las Vegas hotel room with $2 million worth of heroin in a suitcase that he was trying to sell, and did time in an American prison for. He was a drugs dealer, literally, with heroin in a bag in a Las Vegas hotel.
Two minutes, James.
Who ended up as the anti-corruption. So that is a hugely significant, and the extent of the finance that went in. The numbers are stupendous. Some people say 1 trillion, some people say 2 trillion. I don't really understand what $1 trillion is, but the figure you read is nearer $2 trillion poured in by the occupation forces over the time. I won't say most of it, much of it straight into the pockets of corrupt politicians and officials in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, if you get a senior government position or a position in the civil service, we would expect if you got a job in the civil service, you get paid a salary. So you go to work and they pay you. In Afghanistan, it works a different way around. If you want a job in the civil service, you have to buy the job. Apparently, the going rate for a job in the narcotics agency is $200,000 a year. You've got to pay the money to get the job. Why? Because once you've got the job, you can make huge amounts of money out of the corrupt activities. That's a level of corruption inside the state. And ordinary Afghanis see that, and corruption on that level is hugely, hugely corrosive to the legitimacy of any sort of authority. And that is really, really important. The Afghan National Army, absolutely the same.
Oops, sorry.
Hello, are you?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, it's all right. Keep going, James. You've got a couple of minutes. Yeah,
so I've just disappeared. Oh, that's fine. Something went really weird in my screen there. The Afghan National Army, again, hugely corrupt. We've seen this, officers selling equipment, the idea of ghost soldiers. The Afghan National Army was supposed to have a 300,000 members of it. It's estimated up to 60% of those didn't exist. They were simply names on lists that officers used to claim the salaries to pay them and just pocketed the salaries themselves. That level of corruption is absolutely huge. And finally, just to talk about the brutality of this past period. Again, the estimates vary depending on who you look at, but something up to 240,000 people killed in the Afghan war zone since 2001. Obviously, the vast majority of those Afghani civilians. In terms of the American military point, 700,000 military troops deployed, 6,500 killed, 450 British troops killed. And the occupation and military operations took place after 2001. 2 or 3 years are relatively quiet, by the way, after the collapse of Taliban in 2001, but by the mid-2000s, the military operation ratchets up, more troops are deployed, more fighting is done, and that fighting is hugely, hugely destructive in terms of any legitimacy or authority the government had. Bombings, drone attacks, house raids, mass arrests. And if you read the stuff from serving soldiers, particularly intelligence officers, what intelligence officers say is that the troops on the ground always wanted us to be able to tell them who are the bad guys, who are we going after, and we didn't know. We had nothing, so they just went into an area and shot who they saw or rounded up who they saw. And if you think about that, that's what drives the resistance to it. That's what makes this occupation so incredibly unpopular. And that's why, despite the fact Afghan people had experienced the reality of the Taliban government, when it comes to going to defend this corrupt and brutal occupation and the government, the Afghan government that supported it, people simply stood aside and didn't do anything at all. Okay, to conclude, what do we do about it? What can we do? I think there's 2 things we can do. On the ideological level, we need to have an argument using, obviously, some of the points I've made this evening. We have to continue that argument with people on the left. There's lots of debate and argument going on around it's fantastic stuff to read that people should read that's out there, been written in the last couple of weeks and further back about Afghanistan, to inform ourselves, arm ourselves, the argument about imperialism and the destructive nature of imperialism. And practically, as Mary said in her introduction, we have to raise the demand about refugees. We have to say Afghan refugees and all refugees are welcome here. The British government, up until 4 days ago, was still putting people on flights back to Kabul. People who were in this country claiming asylum, in many cases been here for many years, putting them on planes back to say Afghanistan is a safe place to return to. We have to say no returns and let the refugees in. And I think as a practical campaigning level, that's a really important thing to do, and I'll shut up now.
Thank you very much, James. Oh,
unmute him. He's not unmuted.
There we go. Sorry, I'm unmuted now. Sorry about that. Okay, yes. Look, really interesting points. Lots of questions. Some people come back and respond to questions, and I do apologise if I don't necessarily come back on absolutely everything, but I'll try and deal with some of the issues. So let me just try to think how to do this. So I think I wanted to pull together Keith's points right at the beginning and elements of what Stephen has just said right now in terms of, I suppose, what we might call the anti-war argument, the argument about troops going in the first place, etc., which I think is really, really important. And I think if we think back to the time of the first of 9/11 and the immediate post 9/11 situation and the invasion of Afghanistan, it's out of that movement that the anti-war movement was constructed and built. It was tougher argue against the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 than it was against the invasion of Iraq 2 years later in 2003, because of, as I say, the humanitarian intervention argument seemed to be a stronger card to be played at that time. It had been rehearsed very, very strongly, etc. But nevertheless, it's important that that argument did cut very, very significantly with large sectors of the population. And I think, as Stephen says, the roots of those arguments are still out there in society. They're still there and they resonate with ordinary people. And I think the interesting thing we've seen it demonstrated today in Parliament is in nowhere in the political establishment, with the exception of literally a handful of a few Labour MPs, is that sentiment really echoed and reflected inside the political establishment. The whole premise of today's parliamentary event, basically, sort of ritual that went on in Parliament, was essentially to put a narrative to say that we were right to go in. It was a great and noble thing we did. We were doing very well. We did fantastically good work there. And it's all gone wrong at the end for various reasons, like that bloody Joe Biden, chickening out at the end or whatever. All those sorts of arguments, which are completely fatuous nonsense. As somebody, I can't remember, mentioned, I think Kevin mentioned in his piece, I think, that really support for the intervention in America has plummeted. Back in 2001, 2002, support for the invasion of Afghanistan was running at 80 to 90% in the USA. Now, actually, support for pulling the troops out, the deal that effectively Trump did and Biden's pulled through at, is running about 70% in the United States. So Biden's coming under some flack at the moment, but actually, the idea that we need to get out and not be in there is generally, I think, relatively popular in the United States. I think it plays here as well. And I think the argument about soldiers and the anti-war argument about troops and criticising the troops is interesting, because it always was a tension when the Stop the War movement was at its height. And we were very, very clear. We ran whole numbers of campaigns, didn't we, with soldiers, didn't we, and soldiers' families during the anti-war campaign. And there also was a tension within that. And I think quite successfully, to an extent, the ruling class have constructed a narrative since that period around supporting our troops, Home for Heroes, all that sort of stuff that's been developed, which has been to try and, I think we were quite successful in the anti-war movement with driving a wedge between the idea that you support soldiers and their families and what they're going through, and you don't support the war. And there's been quite a concerted attempt by the ruling class to close that gap, to have this idea of support for the military. And that's become a far more prominent thing in society. And I think but nevertheless, within that, I think there are still contradictions. And I think some of the stuff that's coming out from soldiers and the story that Keith told about the petting zoo, I think reflects those things. So I think there are important things to say that. I think that the questions that I think Marion and others raised about corruption, and Caroline raised about corruption, I think have been dealt with pretty well in the discussion. So I don't particularly want to go back to those, apart from really to come back and develop, I think, on Kevin's point about corruption, which I think is very, very important. And I think this goes to the heart of a deeper analysis, if you want, of the sort of problems of what you might call sort of capitalist development in parts of the global south, or the so-called underdeveloped world. Is there a route really towards a sort of national economic development along capitalist modes? And I think that's really, really important. There's a real vogue, isn't there, on social media? You see it in the context of Afghanistan as well, for people to share old pictures, don't they, of Kabul in the 1970s or somewhere else in the 1960s, with lots of modern buildings and cars and women in Western dress and all that sort of thing, to sort of say that things have gone backwards, etc. And they do. I mean, there are real problems with that. They do reflect a certain element about the post-war world, and the idea that in large parts of the global south, the former colonial powers, Africa, parts of Asia, etc., they did appear to be, for national ruling classes, and many of those were driven by sort of nationalist and quite progressive nationalist ideas, that there was a sort of route towards economic and social self-development. You could build up your industries, import substitutions, develop an industrial base, educate people, etc., etc. There seemed to be a route towards what you might call a sort of development in that way. And I think that became a key sort of driver of a degree of what you might call sort of anti-colonial nationalism in the post-war period, in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s onwards, etc., etc. You saw it in large parts of the global south. Really, I think that is almost completely gone now, isn't it? What are the routes and models towards that form of development? And I think you can see that in even where you have so-called success stories of development in places in the global south. I'm moving away from Afghanistan here. I mean, for example, Ethiopia is touted as a very successful country in terms of its growth of GDP over the last 15 years through the implementation of certain neoliberal reforms, etc., etc. But you look at the social situation in places like Ethiopia, actually the gap between rich and poor has widened, levels of endemic poverty have widened, all the sort of indices of social breakdown have widened, etc., etc. So those models and pathways of national simply are closed. And I think that one route out of that is towards an idea of far more radical politics and the idea of revolution. I think the frustrations of that does drive radical politics from below, sometimes of a reactionary character. And I think that's important. I think, and Stephen is actually right to say, the Taliban do not represent a progressive movement. They represent, conservative and reactionary political ideas, both in social terms, in terms of their attitude towards women, etc., etc. But those movements are nevertheless movements that are driven from below because of the crisis in neoliberal capitalism and what it does to these societies, where it breaks up these societies, particularly breaks up, in the case of Afghanistan, the sort of rural communities in that context. And the other thing I just want to say about Afghanistan and the sort of roots and base of support for the Taliban as well, that the crisis in the countryside in Afghanistan is very, very acute, and that also another important driver of that is climate change. Let's be absolutely clear. And this is actually not new. There's been, periodic droughts and famines in Afghanistan driven by climate change. The sort of self-sufficient agriculture of basic agricultural production and also livestock management that Afghan agriculture is dependent on becomes more and more difficult to sustain, given the dynamics of climate change. Is one of the things that's driven the exodus from the countryside. It's one of the reasons why the population of Kabul is now 5 million, when it was just over 1 million in 1996. And that's not uncommon if we think about the roots of the Syrian crisis, for example, in terms of the growth of huge urban slums around the major centres, of the growth of these urban populations, not people involved in the classics of 19th century urbanisation model. We think about urbanisation being workers coming to work in the factories, industrial work. These aren't people becoming an industrial working class. They're becoming part of the urban poor. And in Afghanistan, that's hugely significant. It means Kabul has been transformed really in terms of its size and scope, partly because of the growth of a middle class who are able to benefit to some extent from the cash flowing in and the development and the sort of service industry and infrastructure that develops around a huge level of military occupation and NGO implementation into a country. There's lots and lots of people and jobs to service that and function that has driven that. But that makes for some important and significant things. So no, those are important and are the important points. Now let me just have a quick look at some of the other points. Yeah, Anthony asked a point about global Britain, and I think that's a really interesting question. And I think really you saw in Parliament today, didn't you? Yeah, the truth of the matter is Britain has had a role. We shouldn't let Britain off the hook as an imperial power in these American adventures in the Middle East. Not particularly because of what Britain can bring militarily to the table, although Britain's not insignificant in terms of its military assets it can deploy, etc., but because of effectively the sort of cover that Britain gave. This was particularly important in the Iraq and Afghanistan invasions back in the day. The fact that what Tony Blair's key role there was to give you the political support to George Bush, the cover that George Bush needed to be able to present this as not merely an American thing, but as part of a broader alliance, etc. It's that political role that Britain gave to it, which is fantastically important. So Britain doesn't play an important role, but Britain in no way plays an independent role in that sense. Britain's independent role as an actor in that sense has been and it's a fantasy of the sort of Johnson global Britain idea that somehow Britain can play this fantastically significant independent role. And this idea that the Americans are pulled out, but maybe we can stay in there militarily and hold something together, just complete and utter fantasy that's been. And for those people mouthing that stuff in Parliament today, simply to say that stuff exposes the ridiculousness of those propositions. So I think that opens up all sorts of interesting conundrums and problems, I think, at the top of the Tory party. It's interesting to say that Johnson was getting lots of flack today, wasn't he, from within the Tory party. There are real schisms, I think, within the Tory party about these sorts of issues, I think, that are important for us. Okay, so just really then we dealt with the issue of corruption, I think, yeah. So really then to sort of try to draw some concluding remarks in terms of how we argue what we do. I think it's an incredibly important moment for us. And as a couple of people have said, this isn't a new set of arguments for the people in our political tradition. In many ways, our organisation, our political tradition was tested 20 years ago, weren't we, when this whole war on terror phase really took off. And we had to develop an approach and an orientation, both in terms of our analysis and our sharp and critical analysis of imperialism. We had to develop a very, very sharp and critical analysis of how we talk about political Islam and the sorts of movements that arise, anti-imperialist and radical movements that arise in parts of the Middle East and North Africa, which, whilst they are anti-imperialist and radical in that sense, embrace very, very conservative values. And a really, really important arguments we developed in our organisation. I'd urge anyone to go back and read Chris Harman's writings on the Prophet and the Proletariat in terms of orientating ourselves about how because a lot of people, I think, on the left, and as Rafe said, it's not just right-wingers who are articulating what you might call confused art. Lots of people around the left, generally people who would be involved within coalition work around lots of things, people who will be standing with us on the protests we do about letting in Afghan refugees will nevertheless have very, very ideas, very muddled and confused, a long way away from our tradition on these things. We have to assert and argue in as fraternal way as possible those issues and ideas. So I think that argument is really, really important. Asserting those arguments about the nature of imperialism, the nature of these movements, how we have to argue about and relate to them is really, really crucial. And the other thing that, of course, it taught us was how to work in mass movements, develop mass movements around the Stop the War coalition, a political method of how, as a relatively small group of radical revolutionary socialists, we can put around us and build significant political movements around Stop the War, and we're again doing a similar thing around the anti-racist movement today, around stand up to racism, etc. Really, really important that we can do that. The method of the United Front, how we argue in this time of acute crisis, when these crises are thrown up time and time again, and throw up the potential for organising and putting around us groups of people who will do activity around some of these things. That method is really, really important. I think, again, just to reiterate, the practical element of that means that I think over the next days and weeks, we have to throw ourselves into the demands around defence of Afghan refugees, of all refugees, to stop the deportations, to stop what Priti Patel is trying to do. Already the Tories, there's a schism growing up again inside the Tory party between those people like Patel who simply want to close the door, and some people who are saying, well, surely we have to do something, etc. Within that context, I think we can push for a far more broader sort of anti-racist and pro-refugee sort of politics into that. And I think that's a really important part of some of the practical tasks that come out of it. And I'll shut up now because I've rabbited on for far too long.
Thank you very, very